Okay, so this is Nikki, and I am joined here by Elizabeth, and we are presenting this week on chapters 15 and 16 of the Stone book Policy Paradox, as well as providing sort of a brief course wrap-up and our thoughts on the course. So I'm going to start first by discussing chapter 15. So in this chapter, Stone focuses on the rights paradigm as a possible solution to various policy problems that affect communities. So she goes on to describe how the idea of rights is a long-standing solution in the United States to resolving policy problems, such as, she points to sort of how various political debates are all framed in terms of rights. So some examples she gives are sort of, if you look at the abortion debate, there's the right to life side and the right to choice side. If you are to look at the debates between state and federal rights, or if you look at tax debates, often it's a question of who has a right to use my money and how. So in terms of information policy, this kind of made me think of certain rights that we think of our users as having. So for example, we think of our users in libraries as having a right to privacy, and that can also extend to organizations. Typically, employees expect that their documents are to be kept private, and usually you also agree as an employee to maintain some kind of privacy over what's going on inside your organization. I also thought about the right of access. So I know that in general, librarians consider it a principle to allow people to access the information they want to access. So then Stone goes on to describe that there are two broad discourses in the rights tradition. She defines them as realist and normative traditions. So a realist tradition, the realist tradition of rights is, quote, and I'm quoting her, "A right is a citizen's claim backed by the power of the state," which you can find on pages 331 and 332 of Policy Paradox. And the normative discourse defines a right as sort of being defined by some kind of higher or moral power. That could be a religious law or text, that could be the idea of natural law, or some other type of way of defining a moral principle. So there she does provide a chart on page 333 that sort of describes the differences between those rights. So I'm just going to go ahead and go over that now. So in this tradition, a realist right is something that is backed by the power of the state, versus a normative right is whatever people in a given society ought to be able to do, have, or expect from fellow citizens and the government. The realist discourse would say that rights derive from the power of the government. The normative discourse would say that rights derive from some source other than power, such as morality, religion, rationality, or natural law. And lastly, the realist discourse would say that people can have rights only to those things they claim and for which the state backs them up, versus the normative discourse would say that people can have rights to things they don't actively claim and for which the state would not back them up. So those are basically the two broad ways of seeing rights in their relation to policy. And Stone does point out that these two discourses are inseparable. They both are in operation in creating policy, and they kind of form from what I would call a discursive loop, because basically we use our ideas of what are normative rights, that is to say what we think human beings or citizens ought to have based on some moral principle, to then take action to define what we would call a realist right, which is to say a legal right. So actually this whole topic made me think of the Patriot Act early in the Bush administration, Bush 2, and sort of librarians' response to that. So there was a law that said the government has a right to view your library records, and which I guess could be seen as a realist view since it's deriving from power. And librarians kind of leaned on a normative definition of rights to say that no, our users have a right to privacy, and we're going to avoid these legal parameters by just not keeping records. So therefore, you can't come in. Even though you say you have a legal right, we're going to make it impossible for you to exercise that. So then in the next section, Stone outlines 2 ways of understanding how legal rights offer a solution to policy problems. So the first way is could be described as procedural rights, which Stone defines as saying procedural rights spell out a process by which important decisions must be made. And you can find that on page 334. So she gives examples such as a right to a trial. So you have, under the US Constitution, you have a right to have a jury of your peers, to have a judge, to have a lawyer, and all sorts of other things that we associate with a trial. But that right does not guarantee you a certain outcome. So it can't guarantee you freedom or a conviction if you're the prosecutor. So it defines a process or a procedure. Then she also says that there are substantive rights, which go beyond procedure to outline specific actions and entitlements. And so substantive rights can be either negative or positive. So she gives an example of negative substantive rights, such as, basically it's the right to do things free of restraint. So she basically points to the Bill of Rights as a great example of substantive negative rights. So basically listing all the things the government cannot prevent you from doing. Substantive rights can also be positive. So she defines that as, quote, an entitlement to have or receive something. And that's on page 335 of Stone's book. So in terms of sort of information policy, what this section made me think of in terms of negative, well, actually, I want to go back to procedural rights. So for example, this in terms of information policy, procedural rights section made me think of how organizations may or may not respond to government subpoenas. So I'm thinking of social media companies like Facebook or Instagram or any type of company that has a whole bunch of your data, and how they respond to the government's request to look at your data. So they have usually and hopefully have a procedural, you have procedural rights in that process. Basically, they can say, hey, here's what we're going to do to decide whether or not we're going to hand your information over to the government. But that procedural process does not guarantee you a yes or no answer. Also, going back to information policy and this section of rights, her discussion of negative substantive rights versus positive substantive rights actually made me think of something that's happening a lot locally with librarians in Philadelphia, which is to say the role that librarians have in responding to the opioid crisis. So for example, I think in general, most libraries recognize that users have a negative right, I guess, to enter the library. We don't really prevent people from coming into the library of the idea that anyone can come in. So there's a guarantee of access. But there's not necessarily a positive right to that. So for example, if you're an addict, we will let you in, but we don't, I guess the current question is, what can or should librarians do to assist you after you've let in? So there's a lot of debate over whether librarians can or should be stockpiling Narcan, and or administering it to patrons that they view are overdosing. Okay, so then Stone goes on to talk about what defines a legal right, and she says that there really have to be three elements: an official statement, a grievance process, and a remedy. And if you have all of those three things, then you can say that you have a right, a legal right. So that actually basically made me think of sort of the information rights that we sign up to when we work for a company. They usually have an official statement about what they're going to do with your information. There's usually someone to whom you can complain, like an HR department if you feel that they've used your information incorrectly. And usually there is a remedy, whether that be financial or not. So basically that's an example of a legal right in terms of looking at it in an information policy aspect. So she goes on to further define each of the three elements. Once again, that's a statement, a grievance process, and a remedy. So a statement is a formal legal rule such as legislation, constitutional amendments, basically anything that says in writing, this is a right that X citizens have. And citizens have multiple access points. It provides citizens with multiple access points for addressing grievances, let's say. So you can do state courts, international courts, federal courts. There's a lot, common law. There's a lot of different ways that you can access those statements. The next element of a legal right is a grievance process. So those can be things like courts, judges, anything that's settling a debate, which of course brings about debates about neutrality, which is to say, should courts be basing their judgments just on facts alone, sort of as what Stone would call the rational view, or should they be looking at the greater context of society when making their decisions? So this actually made me think of the Valerie Plame case in terms of information policy. And basically, if you don't remember what happened there was a government official, Scooter Libby, who leaked the name of a CIA agent to a New York Times reporter, who then publicized that name. And there was a whole debate about whether or not that was right, and there was a whole grievance process and a special prosecutor, which actually, I believe Scooter Libby was convicted, but that may be overturned soon, according to recent news. So then the third element of a legal right is enforcement. So there has to be some way to back that right up. In the rights paradigm, the enforcement really puts the onus on the rights holder. So we are really in charge of saying, hey, you're infringing upon my rights. Our government, for example, doesn't really go out and look for ways in which they are not, I guess, offending upon or obstructing they don't really go out and say in which ways are we not guaranteeing rights. It's generally up to citizens to say, I feel I have this right and but it's not being guaranteed legally, so let me go through the grievance process to make it a legal right. Which is kind of, I think, a problematic part of the individual rights paradigm, which is to say that those that have the least amount of power have the most amount of responsibility in affecting change. Stone goes on to say that basically a judge can make a decision, but that's just a statement until somebody backs it up, which made me think of the classic case in United States history of Andrew Jackson in the Supreme Court, with regard to the Trail of Tears, where they basically said this is unconstitutional, you cannot force the Cherokee off their lands. And Andrew Jackson pretty much said, how are you going to stop me? And, I have the army. So basically, rights need to be backed up with power is basically that last critical element. She also points to the Brown v. Board decision, which at first was enforced very stringently by the courts, and we saw forced busing in the 60s and the 70s. And then as public debate kind of shifted to the other side, we've stopped enforcing those segregation rules, and more or less public education is just as segregated today as it was prior to Brown v. Board of Education, even though technically we all have legal rights to equal education. So then in the last part of the chapter, Stone discusses the various ways in which the idea of rights has been justified in the polis, basically her whole critical framework for society. So there are different types of ways of saying this is why we need rights. So she goes through basically three of them. The first is one we've talked about before, the normative discourse of rights, which is to say people have a moral right to something, and moral ideas lead to legal claims. So throughout this whole section, she uses the Brown v. Board decision as kind of a way to illustrate all of these different justifications. So I guess a moral aspect of the Brown v. Board decision would be, for example, if you know the doll test experiments, in which basically psychologists argued that segregation has a detrimental effect on Black children, and the court found that there was a moral argument against that. You could also justify the idea of rights through sociology. So that is comparing the law with current society and changes that have occurred since the writing of the law. So again, looking at Brown v. Board, Stone points out that although there really is no explicit right to education in the U.S. Constitution, when the courts were looking at the Brown cases, they basically said, even though there's no right to this, you really cannot participate in society fully without it. So there is an implied right, even if it's not a stated right. And for example, actually, sorry, I don't want to go over that. So then the last way rights have been justified is a political rationale. And then she gives a whole table again, which is on page 345, which I'm going to look at. And she titles that sorry, let me just find it. Rationality model versus the polis model, which is basically kind of this whole book. As you know, she is going against the rationality model or pointing out the ways in which it doesn't work or problematizing it. And she is advocating for the polis model of defining legal rights. So in the rationality model, people would rely on official statements of rights, versus in the polis model, people get beliefs and ideas about rights from moral philosophy, media, and other people. In the rationality model, official statements of rights are clear, and judges merely apply formal rules to the facts of the case using logic and reason, which is kind of, I guess what she would describe as the myth of rights, the myth that we can arbitrate these things neutrally without context. So she advocates for another understanding, which is to say that official statements of rights are never perfectly clear. Judges must interpret formal rules, and when they do that, they use their own norms, beliefs, morals to do so. Again, in the rational model, it would say that judges are not influenced by power of disputants, which, as we already saw, is often unequal, versus the polis model would ask you to look at those power differentials and how they play out in defining rights. So those are just a few examples of how she contrasts different political justifications for the idea of rights. So then finally, she asked the question, do rights work? Does the idea of rights guarantee the outcomes that it promises to do and solve the policy problems that it promises to solve? So she kind of treads the line here. It can go either way. So sometimes the idea of rights can be very transformative in society, as we saw, for example, in the many civil rights movements that erupted in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s. But sometimes they can not have teeth. So that goes back to whoever has the power to enforce the law is basically the arbitrator of rights, which is kind of a problem, because then people's rights really depend on who has political power. So that's kind of a problem with framing solutions to policy problems as rights. But on the other hand, we generally use our ideas about morals and what human people deserve or have as rights to define our legal policies. So again, it's kind of this loop where you need both things. So yeah, that was chapter 15. And now we'll give it over to Elizabeth.
All right, that was great, a great summary, I think. All right, so I am going to talk about chapter 16, which is entitled Powers. The author makes the point that she's using the term powers to mean policy, which I really had not thought about the two as synonyms. So, you know, as the chapter progresses, she kind of gets into why she thinks that's so. But not only are these metaphoric synonyms, power as we think of it and policy are dependent on one another. And that's how I had more thought about them, is that you, in order to implement policy, you need some level of power or influence or whatever, and then they kind of go back and forth. And so exactly that, she makes the point in the chapter that to make policy, governments or organizations need power. They need the authority to act and need the capacity to act. In other words, make the policy and then carry it out. It's kind of like a chicken and an egg thing, is how I saw it. There are 6 major themes in the chapter. And what I'm going to do is I'll list them out now, and I'll talk about them in some detail as we're going along. The first area that Stone talks about is changing the membership of the voters and the citizenry. Second is changing the leadership. Third is centralizing or decentralizing authority, changing mechanisms of accountability, shifting or delegating authority to the private sector, power and accountability in international relations beyond national borders. The first area, membership and citizenship. A key point I took away from this section is the statement on page 357, and it's a quotation, so I'm going to read it to you all. What can democracy mean in states with large populations of non-citizens who are subject to government decisions but can't influence them? And I found it profound because it certainly is germane to a lot of the topics that we hear about today. You know, national, state, and local news, where we talk about people who are in the country. But I thought she couched this in a really nice package that, you know, I hadn't really thought about people being affected by laws and policies in that way. So even though I kind of knew it. But anyway, there is a history of excluded sections of the population throughout U.S. history. African Americans and women are just 2 examples of that. Millions of people around the world, not just here in the U.S., are affected by that question. I think there are pockets of people in lots of different countries that could serve as examples of this issue. A key policy question to consider in regard to this issue, which to me sounds like the who's in and the who's out question. How does it incorporate or exclude the voices of people affected by the policy? So that kind of gets back to the, what are we doing with the policy to whom are we doing it, and why are we doing it, and what's the effect of all that. So I thought that was really made some good points there. The second section, selecting and changing leaders. This section focuses on the issue of how citizens exert influence over individuals in political or organizational power. Stone talks about descriptive representation, which holds that representatives who share important social and economic characteristics with their constituents can best represent their interests. She also discusses substantive representation, which holds that representatives must explicitly share important policy beliefs and goals with their constituents to represent them well. So with the descriptive representation, she talks a bit about, even though she didn't use the word, what I would call gerrymandering, where you are you creating, if you create a district that has, let's say, African Americans or whites or Hispanics, why are you doing it? Are you doing it because you think that people who have like cultures or it's making an assumption that people who have things that you think or have in common are better able to represent those people? I think there's a slippery slope in making those kind of decisions, but of course I'm just, voicing my opinions. So I had never heard it described as descriptive. So substantive representation, I thought she was moving more towards supporting that type of representation, although she sounded like she had concerns with both of them. Seems to me if you're one person, one vote is the way to go, but then that gets back to membership and citizenship. So it does make things complicated. The next area of focus is centralizing or decentralizing authority. This section opens with a question: how centralized should power be? This question has been fundamental to the development of our U.S. constitutional democracy. We started out with an Articles of Confederation, a loose confederation of states, and then that really, in my mind, the final decision that, they got rid of the Articles of Confederation fairly quickly and developed the Constitution. But kind of the idea of a strong federal union was finally solidified during the Civil War, because that was one of the issues that we were fighting about during the Civil War. But decentralization gives local officials flexibility to adapt policy to their own local conditions. Centralization can overcome the ability of local elites to dominate in small communities. Stone uses Medicare and Medicaid as examples of federal programs that are administered by the states. The policy is set at the federal level and enforced at the state level. So maybe that's an example of the best of all worlds, that the federal government says the states must have these programs, and they fund them to a certain level, but they allow the states to administer them. And hopefully the states administer them in a way that's best for their own local populations. And I would also, the next step would be to evaluate the programs at the state and federal level to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Next area is changing mechanisms of accountability. I thought the opening paradox in this section was intriguing. Stone says, The people choose and control their leaders, who once in office control the people. So, that kind of, again, sums up some of the things that we think about and talk about on a daily basis. Accountability should be key to addressing this policy paradox. How do people in power interact with the people they govern? We have opinions about that. Some are better than others. Maybe some might not be the best interpersonal at interpersonal level, but they're good policy makers and they're good politicians. It's really, to me, it's just really hard to tell. But Stone makes the point that citizens have an opportunity to use their vote to enforce accountability with their elected officials. And I think it's certainly true. That's our fundamental right. If we don't like what's going on, we can use the power of the ballot. Shifting or delegating power to the private sector. Stone makes the point that many governmental functions have been outsourced, and that is certainly true. Having worked in the federal sector, I'm going to, I guess, throw in my own 2 cents worth here and say I would agree with that statement. On page 374, she makes the point that when the private sector carries out the bulk of national defense, citizens have less opportunity and motivation to debate foreign policy and deliberate whether they want the nation to fight a war. So I'll just go on and say, although I see her point with this statement, I would submit there that there still is a government decision-making process with many aspects of these and other outsourced functions. Even though the tasks may be outsourced, a government official is still making key decisions on how to proceed. That's been my experience. I know the agency I worked for did make the decision to outsource some of the job categories. It just didn't seem to make sense over time to build a robust career track in certain things, or we outsourced a lot of the IT functions because it was so hard to find qualified individuals, well, that were as qualified as commercial contractors. So it's tough, and I've seen it wax and wane over the years. A lot of times, there's a drawdown in the federal workforce, and then there's an increase in the contractors, and then there's a decrease in the contractors, but then that means there's usually an increase in the federal manning table. So I think it waxes and wanes depending on who's making policy. Next is accountability in global politics. This section discusses the symbiotic relationship between developing countries who depend on and take aid from Western federal agencies. Stone makes the point that when a donor agency tries to withhold aid because a government has failed to meet its conditions, it comes under strong pressure from government agencies, businesses, and other aid agencies who claim rightly that without the aid they can't function. They are in a chicken and an egg situation. So I think we both want to say some points about the conclusion section and the wrap up. So Nikki, why don't I throw it back your way, and then I'll say a few things, and then I guess we can wrap up.
All right. In thinking about wrapping up the course, I keep coming back to the section of Stone's introduction where she talks about information. And so there are several key quotes that I think should inform our actions and decisions as informational professionals. So first she says on page 331, quote, "In the polis, information is never complete. We can never know all the possible means for achieving a goal or all the possible effects of an action, especially since all actions have side effects, unanticipated consequences, and long-term effects." She then goes on to say, "Information is never fully and equally available to all participants in politics. There is a cost to acquiring information, if only the cost of one's own time." And then she points out lastly, when she's talking about information, that political actors very often deliberately keep crucial information secret. So for me, our role as librarians and other information policy professionals is to remember those three key points, that information is always changing. Our job is to help our users find the most up-to-date, most relevant information, that it's never fully available or equally available to all people, and as information professionals we often have to judge those concerns of access versus privacy. And then lastly, her idea that often very important information is kept secret, and I really think of information professionals as, in some sense, democratizing information and making it available to all. So that is my sum up.
All right. Well, my thoughts are that Stone stresses the differences between the traditional perceptions of policymaking. There is an issue, an organization or agency to define it. Alternatives are considered. A program is developed to address the issue, and then the program is evaluated. Based on a program evaluation, it's either continued, modified, or discontinued. Stone, so what I just talked about briefly was in the nutshell, the kind of the traditional policymaking process. Based on my read of the book, Stone sees the policymaking process as more organic than that. Many of the paradoxes she discusses in our book show that it really is not just as cut and dry as step 1, step 2, step 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever. There's so many different factors that affect what goes into a successful policy. And so this quarter's readings have been a nice blend of specific, a specific and important policy concern. We talked a lot about cybersecurity, and the Stone book also, which discusses policymaking and the various influences on it. The book presented many more policy influencers than I had considered before now. Stone's book is scoped into 3 sections: goals, problems, and solutions. These 3 areas can be applied to cybersecurity or any number of critical topics. We saw it in the video, secrecy. Many of the issues Stone raises in her book can surface in real policy situations. The class has been eye-opening. And that's my take on the situation.
So that's our presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. We've appreciated your time.